Hello, Dominic. How are you?
I'm good.
It's funny because we just did the off-camera welcome and chatted, so that was the very formal how are you doing? So glad that you're here with me today. I love your book. Your Longing
Mm.
Has a Name. I'm so grateful that I was able to do the audiobook narration for that. I want to hear what's going on in your life. You got this book coming out. You're living in Colorado.
Yeah,
I want to hear what you're up to these days, and tell me a little bit about your family if you don't mind.
absolutely. Yeah. So married for 22 years, just about coming up in October. I have a 17-year-old daughter. Well, she's about to be 17. Her birthday is actually later this afternoon.
Terrific.
We have a fuzzy golden doodle named Bella. And one, if you know me well, this is truly a miracle that we now have a cat.
Oh,
So I was never much of a cat person, but let me tell you, this cat has actually changed my heart. It really has. So, yeah, we live here in Colorado. It's gorgeous today. It's like 65. Yesterday was snowing and thundering. So that's kind of what you get when you live out here. We've been out here for about 7 months now. And yeah, we've lived in a number of different places. We were in Portland, Oregon for almost a decade, where I was pastoring a church, and then we were in North Carolina for a year, in England for several years, in Hawaii for 8 years, and on the island of Maui, Vienna, Austria. Yeah, so a number of different places, but this season has been awesome for us. We started a new nonprofit ministry called Pursuing Faith, and now just focusing on writing and speaking and doing a lot of work with nonprofits and churches.
that's great. I do want to talk about your book, but I do want to set the stage too that this podcast is it's for people like me that I grew up learning how to be a super good Christian, in a very conservative evangelical bubble. And I learned how to be very self-righteous and very judgmental. And as I grew older and matured, mellowed, saw the destruction of relationships that had come out of that kind of being that kind of a person. I want to change my ways. And then on top of that, just, like anybody, I've had so many negative church experiences, and
Yeah.
and I don't want to say, it's all God's fault. I wish things were different, but I think it's just a lot of human ness just kind of getting smothered all over everybody. So I don't want to throw out my quest for faith. And so this podcast is hopefully for people like me that we're wanting to hang on to the really good stuff, because I do think in Christianity there is some really, really awesome principles that can revolutionize our world. So I want to talk about your book because there's so many aspects that I connected with. Once again, it's called Faith, or When Faith Fails was your first book. You mentioned that there, but this book is called Your Longing Has a Name. Come alive to the story you were made for. And man, you cast a vision for flourishing and growth. You said it's actually God's desire for us, which yes, amen. But as you say, most people don't feel like their lives are thriving at all. But
Right.
instead, people are tired and worn out from being so worn out for so long.
Yeah.
But you said God wants us to prosper. What does that mean? What's that mean?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think a good place to start would be what it doesn't mean.
Okay.
So flourishing, I've noticed over the last 6 months or so, is really starting to enter the public discourse as a term, a trend. TED Talks now, and large companies use this kind of language. I was out earlier today and saw a big poster about, we're born to thrive, and that kind of word of thriving, prospering, flourishing. What does it mean culturally versus what does it mean when we talk about it from the world of the Bible and what Jesus meant?
Right.
And I think what it doesn't mean is, I think culture has flattened the meaning of what it could actually mean and how it would interact with our life. So you look at positive psychology, which is a whole field of research that kind of came into its own the last century or so. And when they first started to use this language of flourishing, they said it hinges on 5 different attributes, and it's all about having favorable elements in your life. So favorable emotions, engagement, relationships, meaning, accomplishment. Another well-known psychologist, he defines flourishing as the product of the pursuit of an authentic life. There's another term that brings joy and happiness. How? By meeting goals, being connected with life's passions, relishing in accomplishments. So the modern definition of flourishing is kind of like a, follow your bliss cliche, what you'd see at the Lululemon store or whatever, UBU kind of.
But I love
stuff.
all that. I love all that.
Right. Who doesn't? Like,
yeah.
That sounds great. But the problem with it is that it doesn't go far enough. This idea of thriving, flourishing, prospering is actually a beautiful idea. I think the world of the Bible gave us language for that, but as secularism so often does, it robs it of meaning and kind of cuts off the roots from where it came. When you look at the Bible, flourishing is way less about what's happening in your life externally, and it's a posture of the soul. It's participation in the life of God. It's experiencing the presence of God, even in the midst of suffering, even in the midst of pain and heartache. And you're right, as you mentioned, we look at our world right now, I see this dichotomy. I see on one hand, this language of flourishing and prospering and thriving. We all long for that. Why? Well, one reason is we're realizing that we're not thriving, we're not prospering. We're actually not doing very well culturally. I mean, the last couple of years, we have seen in our culture a really dangerous in some respects when you look at the stats on suicide, but a heartbreaking analysis of the state of our culture. We're just looking at the stats over the last few months in our nation. 3/4 of Americans say that they're overwhelmed by stress. 72% say they're exhausted. 68% feel defeated. And one that really got me was 67% say they're lonely. 67%. And about half of Americans say that they're hopeless. So something's happening. Even the stats on thriving. There's research done at Harvard and other places. And the amount of people who say their lives are thriving right now is at a huge low, a low that hasn't been seen since the Great Depression. People are discouraged, insomnia is up, mental health struggles across the board. And so I share that in the first part of the book because we're in this place where our souls are tired. It's a soul issue. We're not talking about an external prosperity issue. We're talking about something within us that's gasping for air. The spiritual writer Thomas More, he said that the great malady of our modern age is what he called a loss of soul. Even the New York Times, they had an article just a few months ago, and they said, really the word that captures the ethos of this moment is languish. It's this old Latin word, which is actually connected to the idea of longing. But the New York Times, they use it in the sense of like discouragement. We're languishing, we're hurting. Our souls are aching. Yeah. And so what I do in this book is to say, okay, what are we aching for? What are the longings of our soul? What is it ultimately that we're crying out for? And how do we pursue that? Because God does give us a vision of flourishing that's far more beautiful than the flat versions that culture gives. How do we experience that in the midst of global unrest and wars in Ukraine and inflation and mental health struggles and relationship disasters? Like, how do we flourish in difficult times? That's the question that really drives the book forward.
Yes, and I'm so glad you're going to give us 3 easy points on how to answer that one.
Yeah, I'll be getting to the same later. Yeah,
no,
this rhyme.
It makes me think like this isn't something that is just like people who don't know Jesus. If you like, this isn't non-Christians, or this is like humanity that we're talking about here. Yeah, because absolutely. I don't see many people that I know that call themselves Christians, I don't see them flourishing in any
Mhm.
like greater degree or any experiencing maybe the fruits of the Spirit. I don't see that. Um,
Mhm.
like any in contrast to many people who would not consider themselves Christian or spiritual people at all.
Mhm.
So that it's just like it's like a basic human thing, and it makes sense that we reach out for these kind of fantastical things, like, "Oh my gosh, did you see that happened?" Or "Wow, can you believe that that's going on?" Or we want to cheer for our, we're looking for distractions, right? We're looking for
Yep.
distractions to take us out of this languishing. And I'm a big fan
Mm.
of really good distractions, like a good
Yeah.
movie, good music, a good meal, great conversation. We're talking with Dominic Doan about his book, Your Longing Has a Name. And there's a few quotes I want to read here that I absolutely love. One is, soul weariness is often a symptom of desire.
Mm.
Love that one. And then you said, flourishing flows from identity. If you want your soul to thrive,
Mhm.
first accept who you are, passionately loved and relentlessly pursued by God. Then you can
Mhm.
step into the story of who you were made to be.
Mhm.
And then this final one, the starting point of flourishing isn't exclusion, it's embrace. Flourishing isn't something you earn because you're driven, it's something you receive because you're loved. That last one
Mhm.
in particular strikes the opposite chord of like how you were talking about, like the more we achieve, the more we produce, the more flourishing
Mhm.
we're going to feel. Like there's satisfaction in that, obviously,
Mhm.
but as far as true flourishing, it's not going to come
Mhm.
from our accomplishments as much as
Right.
it's going to come from realizing how loved we are. And man,
Absolutely.
if how can we help ourselves
Huh.
understand how loved we are? I mean, we always want to go, how can
Oh,
we let those people know how loved they are? But
yeah.
really, like, how can I know how much loved I am?
Yeah. Well, that's why I start the book in the place I do after talking about the issue, the problem, and that is souls that are broken and gasping for air. What's the answer? What's the solution? And as you know, we go to Second Peter and we look at the 7 steps towards a flourishing life. But before we even get to any of that, I first introduce this idea of identity, because we need to know who we are. We need to know what God says about us. We live in a moment where there's a crisis of identity, confusion over identity. And typically, when there's conversations about flourishing in the secular spaces, identity isn't really discussed as much. It's more about the outer self, what's happening in your outer world.
Yeah.
But you got to start deeper than that, right? It's in a place of your soul reconnecting and understanding who God says you are. And from God's perspective, this is the mind blowing thing to me. From God's perspective, when he envisioned us, which is an interesting thought, when he envisioned us before we came to be, like God had a vision of you, he had a vision of me, even before we were created, before we were a thing. His vision of us was a vision of flourishing. Psalm 139 is a good example of that. And his eschatological vision for us, a fancy term that just means in the end, is flourishing, right? It's why Ephesians says we are seated with him in the heavenly realm. So it's kind of this bookend of identity where God, before we were even created, he's envisioned flourishing. He sees us someday flourishing with him. So what is the in-between space supposed to be now? Well, it's living out our identity. It's saying yes to who God already says we are. And to me, that's such a big game changer, because we're not striving for something. That's why I even use the language of gifts in this book, these 7 gifts that God has given us, rather than these are your 7 disciplines or practices. And those are helpful terms, but I think gift is better, because this is God saying, I see you as this. You are my beloved. You are my son. You are my daughter. You are deeply loved. You are in the beloved. You are a new creation. On and on, this language of identity. And if we can begin to embrace that, oh, this is who God says I am, then that leads to a place of flourishing. It's really the foundation of
Mm,
flourishing.
I love that. I have to show you my tattoo on my arm. I don't know if you can read that.
Oh, yeah,
Yeah.
beloved,
Yep. I need to.
dearly loved.
Yep. I want to remind myself every morning I wake up that
Oh,
I am the beloved.
that is cool. When did you get that?
Oh, I don't know, 5 years or so ago. Um,
Okay.
but yeah, that's a
That's so cool. I love that word because I talk about it a little bit in the book.
yeah,
But when Jesus was baptized and the Father said to him, "You are my beloved Son, in you I am well pleased." Um, I always used to read that through the lens of, well, of course, the Father says that about
yeah,
Jesus.
right.
Jesus was perfect, right?
Yeah,
But what's mind blowing is in Ephesians, Paul uses the same language and he says, "You are in the beloved." In other words, the same way the Father spoke over Jesus, "You're my beloved Son and you am well pleased." That's what he says over every single one of us. "You're my beloved son. You're my beloved daughter. I'm well pleased with you. I delight in you. I'm proud of you." I mean, that alone is just such a beautiful insight into the heart of God. And that's how we start to flourish, but that is our foundation.
I absolutely love that, Dominic. I'll tell you, I believed that for a long time, but then I figured out that I needed to somehow like make a living and build a career, and so I
Mm,
started feeling
mm,
like I had to be really, really, really good for God.
mhm.
Not only kind of from a career standpoint, but also to keep seeking, further blessing. Like I want to make sure that God knows that I'm really trying really hard to be a really good Christian. And I know you've done many years as a professional Christian, so I know you
Mhm.
understand, some of that. Uh,
Yeah.
but I, when the pandemic hit,
Huh.
and I stopped touring, I stopped doing my music concerts. I was faced with this question of who am I now? What is
Mhm.
my identity when it's not wrapped up in people clapping for me? Um,
Hmm.
and when I'm not on that kind of that carousel of performance, like who am I? I found a really good therapist. I'm so thankful for him,
Mm.
and he really encouraged me to like waste some time. I need you to waste some time. I'm like, no, no, that's
Huh.
what losers do. And yeah, I'm like, because I'm prone to like, I'm going to be productive as a way of kind of proving my worth and my value. And
Yeah.
I say that because I know that our society is built that way. That's kind of how our
Yep.
society is. Like we do have to pay the rent. We do get greater success the more we prove ourselves to other people. But this God idea of belovedness just for who we
Mm.
are, not asking us to actually even do anything, is
Mm.
so contrarian and it's just so mind-blowing. That's why I want to continually remind myself every day, like, God, thank you
Yeah.
for loving me
It's
so much.
everything. I mean, it was Saint Teresa of Avila who once said that almost all problems in the spiritual life stem from a lack of self knowledge. And that's actually a really insightful statement. It's kind of connected to what David prayed in the Psalms, like, "Lord, create in me a pure heart, renew a steadfast spirit
Yeah.
in me." Or Augustine, he said something very similar. He said, "Lord, let me know myself and know you." um, and I think one of the things that happened during the pandemic, like you just said, is we had to face some of our demons. We had to wrestle with our shadow side. We had to ask the question of identity, because when things are stripped away, when as a pastor, your church is now via Zoom for a season,
Yeah.
when you make a transition in life, uh, that can be challenging because you realize I've built up this facade almost of who I want to appear to be, but is that really who I am? Um, in the book, I talk about this concept that's just been, I'm still chewing on it. I'm still thinking it through, but I call it live without walls. What does it mean to live without walls? Because in time, and everyone learns how to do this, there's a disconnect between our soul and our role. um, where we're one way in front of one group of people and another way in front
Oh
of
yeah.
another group of
Yeah.
people,
Yeah.
but inwardly, we may not be living out of who God says we are or who God has actually called us to be. And part of the maturing process, the way to have a flourishing soul is to learn, what are these walls the armor that I've put up, the masks that I
Yes.
wear, what are they? Identify them, and then begin the slow, painful process of deconstructing them so that I can be true to who God has called me to be. I think that was one of the painful upsides of the pandemic, is that it forced all of us to ask some of those difficult questions and then come face to face with, oh, I was so busy, I didn't even know that was in me.
Yes. That's me. Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And we begin, like Blaise Pascal, he said almost all the problems that humans face, I'm kind of butchering the quote, but he says it's man's inability to stay still in a room by himself. Because the busier we are, rushing, doing things, going places, meetings, all that, and we can have an inflated sense of importance or a sense of disenchantment that we haven't really engaged with, or brokenness lays just beneath the surface that needs to come out. And when we slow down, when we breathe, when we invite God's Spirit into the quiet spaces and the dark places of our life, that's when healing can begin. And what an incredible, painful opportunity it was, during those months of the pandemic, for allow God to do something deeper in us.
Wow, I'm trying to always keep the person listening in mind, going, okay, this sounds great. You guys are super smart and super spiritual, but like, give me something really practical. You know what I'm saying? Like if I was to kind of dissect this down into, or parse it down into a couple simple things, what I hear you saying is pull away. Like, give yourself some space to step away from some of these patterns of behavior that may be causing chaos. Maybe it means turning off a particular TV channel. Maybe it means like not having a conversation with that particular friend, or not engaging on social media. Maybe it means pulling away to a place of quiet where you can maybe pray, maybe for the first time you prayed in a long while, and just like ask God to come into this quiet, like in the midst of the chaos that's swirling around in your heart, and just say, God, I'd love to find out who I am outside of the chaos of this life. And at the core of that, my faith says, I want to believe that the voice then pronounces to that person, you are loved. Like in that, when I pull away, when I'm in my quiet moments, I want to hear God say, you are loved. And then I can start like looking for places in the world around me where I can hear that. Like I want to find a church that says you are loved, and not like you're loved, but fix that up, or you're loved and now get busy. That's how like most places can be. But like you're loved, no buts. Finding people in your life that will speak those words of truth to you that say, you know what? I don't care how many listeners your podcast gets, or I don't care how many spins your songs get on Spotify. I care about you and your heart, because you're loved just the way you are. It's not about performing with me.
I love that, man, because I think the church as a whole, I'm saying this, having been a pastor in different places over the years, we so often fail with that. And yet the way I see Jesus loving people is he intentionally pursued the marginalized, the broken, the wounded, and he put them on display, right? And Lamott, she talks about in one of her books how in ancient Japan, I believe, if a jar was broken, rather than throwing the jar away, they'd actually cover the broken part with a gold leaf. And it wasn't to cover up the brokenness, but rather to draw attention to the brokenness, to say, look, this has a place here on our shelf. This is a thing of beauty. It's the brokenness that actually gives it beauty. You know the street artist Banksy?
Oh yeah.
He's a fascinating guy. I was in New York a few years ago, and he had shown up in the middle of the night. And to this day, I don't think anyone really knows who he is. He's an intriguing guy, but he'll show up in the dead of night and just paint this provocative, thoughtful, political, whatever artwork on the side of buildings or subway stations. And when I was in New York, we're walking down the street, and he had actually been there the night before. And it was this incredible work. But one of the works, which it's so thought provoking, is called "A Girl with Balloon." Yes. And a couple years ago, he put it on auction, and it was for $1.4 million. And the moment it sold, the guy hits the gavel, And the painting, which was in the room, you can actually watch videos of this on YouTube. The moment the gavel hit, the painting then went through a shredder. Did you hear about this?
Oh yeah.
It just started being shredded right in front of everyone, and to the horror of the guy who just bought it.
Yeah.
And so the pieces just they fell to the floor. And some people say that maybe he's making some really provocative thoughts about the death of art and consumerism and all that. But what happened, and I find so redemptive about the story, is the person who bought it, they said, no, I want this piece. In fact,
Yeah.
it's actually more valuable to me now. And now those shredded pieces are worth $25 million. The same thing, but it's shredded, right? And I love that, because I think sometimes the most breathtaking art emerges from what life has shredded to bits. And that's why Jesus chose the disciples that he chose. It's why the gospel always resonates, not necessarily with those who have it all externally, but those who are broken inwardly. And that's what he does with us. And that's what the church is called to be. The church is to be a place where we can come with our shredded bits and our pain and our languish and our hurt and our wounds and our doubts, and there find not condemnation, but like the ancient Japanese, there's grace, there's acceptance, there's forgiveness, there's healing, there's welcome. We all come to the same table, drink the same body, the same blood. That's through that brokenness we find our lives being patched back together.
Boy, that casts an incredible vision for how I would love church to be. And I wish that we could say, oh, you just go next door to that place right there. That's where you're going to find that. It's not that easy. And I think that's what some of the people listening right now are going, man, I tried that and that did not work for me. I would venture to say that it maybe doesn't happen during the 10 o'clock service on a Sunday morning, but maybe it's going to happen as you develop the relationship with some of the people that are choosing to share the same vision for what this life could be like. I love that. I know I want to like skip through the first 6 promises that you had talked about, and the 7th one just struck me so amazing, because you talk about love, and here's a couple of things that I love that you said about love. You said Jesus made it staggeringly simple. The way to become a flourishing, whole, beautiful human is through receiving and practicing the gift of love. As the Russian novelist Leo Tolstoy wrote in War and Peace, love is life. Everything that I understand only because I love. Everything exists only because of love. And then you said, the more inward and self-focused we are, the more our souls collapse from the weight of ungiven love. To love is to give. To flourish is to grow outward. The bigger we are in our minds, the smaller we actually become. That's why Scripture repeatedly urges us to shift our focus away from self to others. Did you write that, Dominic?
I didn't write the Tolstoy part.
No, but that last part, the more inward and self-focused we are, the more our souls collapse from the weight of ungiven love. Come on now. That's freaking awesome.
Oh, thanks, man. It's it, isn't it? Right? It's what the Bible calls agape love. It's a choice that expresses itself in generous action. And for me, one thing that really helped shape and frame my understanding of this kind of love was looking again at the Old Testament and seeing how they define love. I share this interesting word that I came across called tzedakah in Hebrew, which is a combination of love and justice. It's something that we kind of miss in our English version of it, but in the Hebrew world, love and justice were hand in hand. They weren't seen as competing values, but rather these are things that when you're close to the heart of God, you're going to want to share his heart with others. And something I got from Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, he talked about in one of his books how when Israel built their places of worship, there was this sacred piece of furniture that was inside the temple and the tabernacle called the Ark of the Covenant, or think Indiana Jones, right? Yeah. And on top of the Ark was the Kaparet, the mercy seat. And on either side were these angelic faces kind of staring at each other, right? These cherubim. And Jonathan Sacks, he suggests that, in fact, I'll just read you his quote. He said, God speaks where two persons turn their face to one another in love, embrace, generosity, and care. We discover God's image in ourselves by discerning it in another. So the presence of God, in a sense, was found between these two faces,
Yes,
right?
absolutely.
And that's so true. Like in moments like this of conversation and time with your spouse or your friends or at church or a small group or whatever, man, the presence of God is found in those spaces. And I think part of the healing process for those who doubt or deconstruct, for those who are desiring for their souls to flourish again, is to recognize God is present even there. It's like Mary when she went to the tomb on Resurrection Sunday, and she didn't even recognize Jesus. She thought he was a gardener, and he's like, Mary, and then she's like, oh, it's you. And how many times in life I just think, oh, he's just the gardener, or she's just the barista, or he's just my brother, or whatever. People who are in our life that we engage with regularly. What if God is found in between those two faces? What if that actually is sacred ground, an opportunity to understand who God is and to love as he's called us to love?
That's pretty radical, and I love it. And it's easy to kind of put these words on it, like this is how we want to be. Something changed in me when I started to realize like my own belovedness, like that God loves me just the way I am, and that love is kind of more incomprehensible than I could ever imagine, and that God in fact made all of us in His image, male and female.
Yeah.
In his image. And so that means every single person has been made in God's image, and which means every single person can reveal a piece of God to me that the other person can't. Like you uniquely reveal a part of God that nobody else does. And so what that does, when I start looking at other people that way, that makes life like unbelievably magic, because I'm looking for that God part. I maybe don't call it that, but I look for that individual, unique spark that each person has. That to me reminds me that there is God with us, even in these people that we would never imagine us experiencing God with. And sometimes people can't even see it themselves. And if we can shoot love beams from our soul to other people to help them see the spark of God in themselves, man, I feel like that's like a great mission that we could all accept.
Oh my goodness. Yeah, I love that. When you were sharing that, made me think of Kierkegaard. He was an interesting guy, a Danish philosopher, and he loved to tell stories. That's kind of his biggest mode of communication, parables. And in one of his parables, he tells the story of a king who saw a beautiful maiden, and she's out working in the field. She was a peasant, and he sees her. He's like, "Whoa, who is she?" And finds out her name. He's like, "Well, I've got to meet her," because he wasn't married. He didn't have a queen. But then he realized, if I came to her as the king, I wouldn't really know if the love was genuine. And so he dressed up as a peasant and went out in the fields and worked alongside of her. And there they fell in love. He proposed. The day of the wedding came. He says, "All right, be ready on such and such a time." He goes back to the palace. She still doesn't know who he is. And he shows up with all of his soldiers and this parade. And then she's like, I had no idea you were the king, right? And he said, "I wanted you to love me for the sake of loving me, and then I would know your love was true." And I think God comes to us as the peasant many times. He comes in the unexpected places and faces and spaces, a little rhyming. And it's there that I think we actually learn love. And that's just, I don't know, it's a good question, I think, to keep before us as we engage with our days, as we go out into the community, as we go to church or whoever we're connecting with. In what way may God come to me as the peasant today? And how can I receive love and also give love and be love to those who are in desperate need?
I'll go back to what you said about love and justice. How can I assist in the flourishing of that
Mm.
person? I love that. I'm reading, rereading The Road Less Traveled by M. Scott Peck, which is so amazing. And he
Mm.
talks about love as investing in the spiritual growth of another person. And I was like,
Yeah.
whoa, that's so beautiful. And what an assignment. We tend to think of love as just kind of this mushy thing, and it's a feeling driven, whatever it is. But when you say, I'm going to make my aim your flourishing, oh my
Yeah.
goodness. Like how radically changed would our world be
Oh
if
my
even
gosh.
if we just, did that for 2 or 3 or 4 people, like that's a beautiful vision of love and justice combined.
Yeah. And it's how Jesus lived, right? No one modeled a flourishing soul, a flourishing humanity than Jesus. I was reading recently in Hebrews, and it says he was anointed with the oil of joy above all his fellows.
Mm.
In other words, Jesus was the happiest man alive. Like wherever he went, he had a sparkle in his eye. He spoke with grace and compassion, and he'd walk through fields and talk about birds and flowers and what it revealed about the heart of the Father. And there's just something that radiated from him. There was something that was winsome about him. There was a gravitas that pulled other people to him. That's what flourishing is. And Jesus suffered. Jesus was betrayed. Jesus went through heartache. But the source of his flourishing, the spirit that flowed through him, was he made his life about the flourishing of others. That's why you have his most famous sermon was the Beatitudes. Blessed are. And that word blessed, Markorios, in the original language, it's connected to this Old Testament word tamim. It basically means flourishing. That's the original meaning. He's
Nice.
pronouncing flourishing
Yes.
over others. That's what Jesus did wherever he went. And what a counterintuitive, countercultural way to live, because our culture would say you want to flourish, get more money, get a better job, invest in this stock, whatever. But Jesus says, no, true flourishing is you make it your goal, your aim to pour yourself out into the life of others. Like Paul said, I'm poured out like a drink offering. We just keep pouring ourselves out. We need to be refilled too. There's so much joy and found in getting our eyes off ourselves and onto others.
Yes. And I have to believe that the way Jesus was able to do that is because he truly knew that he was
Yeah.
loved. He knew
Yep.
that his whole mission was love. Like
Yeah.
it was rooted in his belovedness, and then the mission was love. So it's like love
Yeah.
is the source, and then it's the
Yes.
medium, right? I love
Yeah.
that. I love you talk about intentional agape love, and you said that
Yeah.
it pursues those that you would label a Samaritan. Somebody
Mhm.
that isn't a part of your politics, your network, your denomination, or tribe. It's the people that grate against your nerves and irritate you. Mark, you're cutting
Yeah.
too close to the bone here. Don't talk about this. Like the people that you'd rather avoid at the office or leave ghosted online. The person that when you
Yeah.
hear they'll be at the party gives you plenty of reasons not to go. Those are the
Mhm.
people God has called you to love.
Mm.
That might be too much, Dominic. I don't
Oh
know.
gosh, man, that story of the Samaritan,
Yeah, I
it's
know.
it's so convicting,
Yeah.
because in that culture, in that day, to even say, did you know, like the word Samaritan was actually a curse word. If you came from a Jewish background, by using it, it was not a word you'd commonly use unless you really wanted to insult someone.
Yeah, we have plenty of those in our
So,
society today.
yeah, so
Yes.
even the idea of a good Samaritan is an oxymoron,
Yeah.
right? I mentioned in the book, it'd be like saying there's a good terrorist who went down the street kicking puppies. Like we wouldn't believe that.
Right.
But Jesus takes someone who's completely outside of the tribe and uses them as an example of what love looks like. And in a day that is so polarized, hyper polarized, by politics, by economics, in a time where people have become more tribal. This is who I identify with.
Right.
This is the politician I
Right.
align myself with. This is the news channel. It's even gotten to that. Like some people are Fox News, other people are MSNBC or whatever. It's like everyone has their tribes, and we live in a digital echo chamber that just reflects and bounces back our own opinions, through the algorithm of what we see online. But Jesus shows us another way where those walls are torn down, and he calls us to intentionally pursue someone that we may not align with, that we don't see face to face with. And I tell you, like, to me, it would be so radical. And I think it'd be a sign of real revival if our churches reflected that, because our churches today across America in so many spaces have become more tribal. Like, oh, this is the church that votes this way. This is the church that I agree with everyone in the room. I agree with what the pastor is saying. But I think true worship is found when we may not see eye to eye with someone, but we can still stand shoulder to shoulder as we worship the same God and come to the same table. It's why in Jesus' group, his disciples, he had Simon the Zealot, who wanted to bring about a revolution and tear down Rome. And on the same team, he had Peter, a tax collector who worked for Rome. That's just crazy, right? It'd be like saying, and there was a Proud Boys guy there and a member of Antifa. And like, what? You're bringing these two sides together. And there was a lot of rough edges. He had to, rub off those lives and get their souls to be what God intended them to be. But I think there's something to that our politic shouldn't be about what political party we identify with. Our politic is we are citizens of heaven. And that's what's needed today. Churches and spaces and Christians who can reflect that, make our politic about Jesus and his kingdom.
Yes. I want to say thank you, obviously, because you're fantastic. And I love conversing with you. And I feel like we could do this for hours and have coffee and then well, hey, you want to get some food? And then we'd be still talking. So I love that. Thank you so much, Dominic. I just kind of want to get an overview from what all we've talked about. We've talked about this longing that so many of us have, that we long to flourish. And in your book, Your Longing Has a Name, you literally say that longing is Jesus. And then you give 7 principles on how we can actually live that out, how that plays out in our lives. And we focused on the 7th one, being a loving person, rooted in allowing yourself to realize how loved you are by your Creator. And as we learn to love, that's when this floodgate of flourishing comes to life. And here's I want to end with this quote from you, if you don't mind. Here's then is our calling and the secret to a flourishing soul: live in love, pursue the wanderer, embrace the fearful, rescue the orphan, binds up the wounds of the fallen, call the outsider your neighbor, show mercy to the doubter, welcome the homeless home, lavish grace on the sinner, live so your love makes non-believers question their disbelief in God. Bro, freaking awesome.
Oh, thank you, man. And I'm so honored too that you read this book for the audio version. You have the amazing speaking voice, and you're so talented at it.
Well, thank you. Thank you for all the work that you've put in over the years to study, to bring a vision to life for this. I hope that even just through our conversation that there might be one person that is given renewed hope and renewed vision, that maybe they are sensing more than ever that the flourishing they thought they were going after isn't really giving them what they wanted, but that perhaps falling into the life of being of the beloved and then giving that love away at every opportunity. I am an example that is the way to a flourishing life. So thank you for putting so many beautiful words on that for me.
Oh, man. Yeah. Thank you for everything you do, man. It's so good to talk to you.